Hey guys, so I'm doing this podcast to try explain in a bit more detail part of Cizwe's section in evolutionary psychology about sexual selection or mate selection. So, as I said, this is just a slightly more in-depth podcast on sexual selection for you guys in case you didn't quite understand everything the first time around. Now, as Cizwe mentioned in his lecture podcast, evolutionary psychology can be very controversial, so please take the podcast with a pinch of salt. So, we first need to understand what evolutionary psychology is before we divulge into any real detail about it. As Cesar has mentioned, evolutionary psychology is a more biological approach at looking at behavior. Evolutionary psychology suggests that our behavior can be explained by internal psychological mechanisms or adaptations that have come about through evolution. Before I go on, I just want to make it clear that I'm going to be using the term sexual selection interchangeably with mate selection and mate preference. It's essentially the same thing, and I will try to stick to one, but in case I forget, just know that I'm using these terms interchangeably. So Darwin theorized that evolution was basically determined by two different forms of selection: natural selection and sexual selection. Natural selection is how a species adapts based off its environment in order for the species to best survive, whereas sexual selection is how a species adapts based off its competition. So this would be when it evolves characteristics that may not seem beneficial to survival but helps attract mates. So since we are looking for a mate that will provide us with the best chance of reproductive success, again according to evolutionary psychology, we assume that these characteristics are in some way beneficial for the species. So for a practical example, if we look at the peacock, we can see that they develop these long, extravagant tail feathers that they use to try attract mates. Besides actually attracting mates, the peacock's bright feathers are pretty much useless in a survival situation, and in fact would more likely attract predators rather than scare them away. So to help explain what sexual selection is, other than just me talking the whole time, I found this short video that may be helpful for you guys. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Charles Darwin was the first to recognize the evolutionary significance of sex. He came to it because his theory of natural selection had a major problem. It beautifully explained why all polar bears have heavy coats. Over time, any trait that improves an individual's chances of survival should spread through the entire population. But it offered no help in explaining the wild extravagances found throughout nature, like the peacock's tail.
Yeah, Darwin had a real problem with peacocks. In fact, he once said, "The sight of a peacock makes me sick," because he really didn't understand how it could evolve.
An extreme reaction, perhaps, but it is hard to see a peacock's tail as something other than an impediment to his survival.
They're heavy, they're difficult to carry around, they take a lot of energy to grow, they're conspicuous, and basically they're going to slow an animal down if it's running away from a predator.
And it wasn't just the peacock's tail that Darwin's theory of natural selection couldn't explain. There were also the elaborately ornamented carapaces of beetles and the Baroque extravagance of butterflies, and even the delicate songs of birds. Theologians of his day argued that God created ornate flowers and feathers to inspire man's wonder and devotion. Darwin was convinced there had to be an evolutionary explanation, just as there had to be an evolutionary explanation for why so many of nature's ornaments are seen only on males.
If natural selection is operating on all organisms the same, why is it in nature that you can see differences between males and females? And these differences are actually quite large. Things like antlers or large body size in males that are clearly connected to maleness or femaleness, as if there were two paths. And this really doesn't make sense if you accept evolution by natural selection. It should be operating the same on everybody.
It took him several decades to think of it, but eventually he happened upon the idea of sexual selection, which is really Darwin's most ingenious idea, I think. These ornaments are not for our good, they're to advertise each individual's fitness, its goodness as a mate to the opposite sex of its own species. In a sexually reproducing species, survival is no good if you don't find a mate. If you don't convince somebody that you're good enough to copulate with, to have offspring with, your genes will die with you. You won't leave any descendants.
Darwin saw two strategies at work in the courtship idiosyncrasies of different species. For males, it's competition. For females, it's choice. Males fight for access to or control over the females themselves, or a resource females need, like food or territory. Sometimes this competition gets downright nasty. But it's just as likely the males of a species will follow the path epitomized by John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, the path of the peacock, seduction through sexual display. This is where female choice comes in.
Would expect that the female who invests more per egg, per offspring, should be much more choosy about who she has offspring with, who she combines her genes with. Whereas the male, who's investing so little, you would expect that he wouldn't care so much.
Darwin's contemporaries had no trouble with male competition. But females actively directing evolution through their choice of mates, that was too much.
This was the aspect of sexual selection that Victorians really had trouble with. They couldn't imagine that mere female animal brains could be shaping something as grand and important as evolution itself.
In those days, females didn't have choices. Males decided who they were to marry, for example, and females really didn't actually have that much say in the matter.
So radical was the idea of female choice that it was more than a century before anyone tested it. Marion Petrie's experiments with peacocks were among the first. According to sexual selection theory, peacocks grow their tails because peahens pay attention to them. And peahens pay attention because only a healthy, fit, strong peacock can afford to grow one.
Yeah, it's got a
To test that, Petrie measured the tail lengths of a captive population of peacocks.
145.
Then she charted exactly which males the females chose over an entire mating season. Her data left little doubt. To peahens, size matters. Next, Petrie tried reducing the number of eye spots in some otherwise well-endowed tails. The result was a lonely mating season for the trimmed birds. Finally, Petrie started playing matchmaker.
We paired females with males with big trains, and we paired females with males with small trains. And then we looked at how being paired to a male with a big train, what effect that had on the performance of the female's offspring. And what we found is that if you were mated to a male with an elaborate train, your offspring survived a lot better. Paternity does matter.
Peacocks are a classic case of evolution operating through sexual selection. Males compete for the opportunity to mate, and females hold out for the best genes. When females choose a trait that is an honest indicator of good genes, that trait spreads throughout the population over generations. It can also become highly exaggerated. It's all a logical consequence of the differing reproductive strategies of males who have lots of sperm and females who have fewer eggs. But the goal isn't just to have offspring. The young have to survive long enough to have their own offspring. Sometimes that requires paying as much attention to behavioral traits as to physical ones.
Lizzie, it's lonely as dying out there. Will you come with me?
In the Hollywood classic The Rainmaker, Katharine Hepburn's struggle to choose between the sexy, quick-witted Burt Lancaster and the dependable Wendell Corey mirrors a deep biological dilemma. For some species, the chances of offspring surviving increase if a female chooses a mate who'll stick around over the one with the best genes.
Okay, so now that we understand sexual selection a bit better, we can look at some of the important principles within evolutionary psychology. So if we refer back to the peacock example, some of us may wonder why the peahens also don't develop these extravagant tail feathers, because surely they also want to attract the best mates possible. This is to do with the different selection and reproductive pressures placed on males and females. Since females have to carry their offspring and care for them until they are old enough to fend for themselves, they have more pressures placed on them and thus have something called a low fitness variance. As these words mentioned, fitness variance is to do with the different selection pressures placed on males and females regarding their mate preferences. So typically, females have a much lower fitness variance than males because they have a long gestation period and they have to look after their young. This means that because of their investment, females can only produce a limited number of offspring at a time. Obviously, this isn't the same for males, as they have minimal investment pressures and therefore have a much higher fitness variance, which allows them to have many children at the same time. Since males have a higher fitness variance and do not need to use their limited resources on child rearing, many species use the extra resources to produce extravagant ornaments, like the male peacock's tail feathers. This constant need to evolve more and more extravagant sexual ornaments to compete against other males is known as runaway selection. Another interesting principle surrounding runaway selection is called Bateman's principle, which basically says that women are a valuable reproductive resource and thus men are the ones that have to try compete for women. This can be seen in both the animal kingdom with male buck jousting against each other, and even in today's society with guys going to the gym to get bigger muscles. Right, so the last section I'll be covering is some of the critiques of evolutionary psychology. So as we all know, every theory has its strengths and limitations, and evolutionary psychology is no different. So the first limitation of evolutionary psychology is that it focuses heavily on heterosexual relationships. This is obviously quite problematic, especially in today's society. Secondly, many critics have said that evolutionary psychology is guilty of biological determinism. This basically means that evolutionary psychology says that sexual selection is the same across different social and cultural backgrounds. Finally, many people have also criticized evolutionary psychology as being too reductionist. This means that everything within evolutionary psychology is said to be attributed to the genetic makeup of the person, which means we have little control over our mate preferences. Right, so that's everything that you guys really need to know about sexual selection as a part of your evolutionary psychology course. I hope this helped clarify anything you guys didn't quite understand from Caesar's lecture. And as Caesar said, I've created a little questionnaire that has a couple of questions on what was discussed in this podcast. There aren't a lot of questions, and it would be extremely helpful if you guys could just fill it out. It literally will take about 2 minutes, so please could you take a look at that. Alright, thanks guys.